in some senses, I welcome the recognition from the government that there is a problem on campus. There's been many polls that have been done, for example, students self-censoring and not feeling able to express their views. We've seen many high-profile incidents of feminists and thinkers being no platformed. We have Amber Rudd, a former minister, kind of no platformed at a mainstream university. And so the kind of question of the freedom of speech challenges on campus has been very high profile in recent years, and it's good to see that there's been a recognition from the top. But there is worrying things about some of the things that have been announced, and I'm still awaiting more details. But freedom of speech can't be imposed from the top down. It's not something that you can pressure your way into or find your way into. It's really got to be believed in our hearts. And I think that it could look slightly authoritarian or even kind of counterproductive if the kind of government is imposing freedom of speech in what should be an open space. And so I guess, although, as I said, I kind of welcome the recognition, there's no clear indication that the government is encouraging students or university staff to really engage with the question of freedom of speech and why it's been under challenge. It can't be pressured from the top down.
But that seems to be exactly what they are doing. The subtext seems to me to be we, the government, are insisting that there is that you have the freedom of speech that we agree with.
Well, and I think that is not what freedom of speech is. Freedom of speech is a universal value, and all people, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, should have an opportunity to have your voice heard. And I think that when freedom of speech becomes associated with the political right or is viewed as partisan or a kind of weapon of government, then one, that's not freedom of speech, but that can chill free speech because people don't feel like they're really able to challenge authority. But I still await more details. I think that something definitely needs to be done. From the perspective of the Free Speech Champions Project, which I founded, we think it should start much earlier. I think sixth formers and school kids should be debating and discussing and getting involved in ideas and really encouraging the engagement with free speech much younger and not something from the top down.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that this sort of thing goes in cycles, doesn't it? I mean, in the you're probably too young to know, but in the 1970s, on Saturday evening family entertainment, people were, for purposes of jokes, using the N-word and the P-word, and they were taking the mickey out of gays and women in general, and all of these things. And so, isn't it just a sweeping of the pendulum from that to what is not exactly an opposite extreme, but the sort of the inverse of that? And if we perhaps just give it a bit of space, it'll come to some sort of sensible middle ground.
Well, I think that is, a good point, but I would disagree because I think, as the phrase goes, that the kind of price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And what that means is, in some senses, freedom of speech is actually quite counterintuitive. It's not inevitable. In many ways, it's against all odds because, why would you want to hear what somebody else thinks if you're very kind of comfortable in your views and comfortable with the way things are? And that means that I think it has to be re-articulated each generation so people understand why people fought and died for it and why it's something that we should continue. But again, that has to be something that is really understood in people's minds and hearts and cannot be seen as a kind of an instrument to forward particular political goals. And I'm not necessarily saying the government is doing that, but the way that it's been framed so far may increase that perception.
There has, as you said, been people who have been deplatformed, as they say. And there were some people that were quite well known, and so they got a lot of press. And then the press seemed to be interested in that story. And then other people whose opinions might actually be sort of abhorrent, maybe that's too strong a word, but disapproved of by the majority of the population, that they being disinvited, that became a big story as well, whereas it probably wouldn't have been had the famous people not been uninvited previously. I mean, is there the chance that this is all being blown up a bit too much, that it's actually not as big a story as people are making out?
Well, I think it is a big story, and I think a lot of people understandably think these are just kind of pesky students that are a bit lefty and a bit annoying. But the reality is that students, the graduate and intellectual class, then end up being part of the institutions like the media, like the cultural establishment, that then shape the public conversation in just a few years after they leave. And so if students do not get a full experience where they're exposed to a wide range of ideas, are able to confront things they disagree with and not retreat, and really engage with the big questions shaping the public conversation, then we, as a wider society, have a much diminished experience. And so this isn't just something that is localized to the university campus. We've heard about kind of cancel culture and censorship and free speech challenges sweeping across the entirety of society. And so I don't think it's blown out of proportion. I do think that it's a really, really concerning issue. And it is something fundamental if we are to have a thriving, diverse democracy.
Well, yes, diverse, but it seems to me, just looking in from the outside, that it's not a diverse section of people that are complaining about this. It's those on the right. It's people who are who define themselves more by who they dislike than who they do like, and they want the ability to express their ire and pour their bile into the internet and to criticize and bemoan people from the stage. And really, should they be allowed to do that? Should that be the law?
Well, I think this is a really good point, because I actually agree with a lot of people that have criticized the way that the free speech conversation has been dominated by like a few that seem to be on the same kind of side, so to speak, of the political spectrum. But I think part of that has actually been because the kind of climate has been so toxic and so hostile that oftentimes the only people left are the people that are willing to be lampooned and say whatever they want, because it's so restrictive. There's not that space for people to feel comfortable. And so I actually think that's a response to the challenge of freedom of speech. But also, many of the people that have been, platformed and censored and cancelled have not been, fringe or hard right. We've seen whether that's J.K. Rowling, Selena Todd. We've even had this kind of question on the left about many Palestinian activists. So this is a problem across the board, where when there's an orthodoxy that ensues, a lot of the time on campus, and at many other institutions, people that are not part of the fashionable or dominant ideas at that time get excluded and have real fearful consequences, such as perhaps losing their job or not actually speaking in the seminars. These are things that are necessary for us to live in a kind of thriving society, and it's a real issue.
But really, I mean, we've got so many outlets for people to express any idea that flits across their mind. Do we have to have all of the outlets open to everybody? Otherwise, people will cloak themselves in the victimhood. Or can people just, okay, so I didn't get to speak in this hall, so I'll go and speak in that hall. If I get chucked off Twitter, then I'll go on Parler or any number of other social media companies that will be open by this time next week. Does everybody have to have the right to speak anything they like everywhere?
No, I think that everyone should be able to say what they want, but not everywhere at all times. So, for example, I don't think, a student in school has the right to denigrate their teacher. Obviously, we have social norms in particular contexts. Oftentimes, those things have evolved over kind of decades, or if not hundreds of years. But certain spaces function for the purpose of a widely expanded domain for public discourse. One of those things fundamentally is university. If at a space, which is essentially the intellectual hub, the place where we create knowledge, cannot even withstand views that are perhaps unfashionable around gender or views on Black Lives Matter, then how else could we have these difficult, complex conversations? And so I don't think this is, everyone can say anything whenever they want. But I think certain spaces should be protected for that very purpose. Universities are absolutely one of them.
Even if the majority of the people who would go there would find the opinions perhaps unacceptable, like for instance, I mean, I don't believe this, but if I wanted to go on the stage at a university and address the students and say, well, you know what, you women here, you're wasting your time. What you should actually be doing is putting on a penny and making my dinner. Would that be acceptable?
Well, look, again, so when the people that are being no platformed and the people that are being censored are not random strangers that people picked out of, the street or a pub. These people are invited, often by students themselves. They're often people that are already very prominent and significant shapers of the debate that a minority, a lot of the time, are uncomfortable with. I mean, right, we've just seen recently today, some people may not have heard of it because it was a small story. Labour students at Oxford were condemning John McDonnell, the former, deputy leader of the Labour Party, for having a conversation with Selina Todd, a kind of gender-critical feminist and historian on working-class history. So it's oftentimes a minority of loud people and students dominating the conversation and shaping the narrative for students as a whole. It's not, people aren't inviting horrendous, evil people. It's mainstream figures a lot of the time and people that are already, part of the public conversation.
But you do understand that what you're saying is that a minority of people, their opinion matters less, regardless of them being made up of individuals, than more people who disapprove of what they are thinking.
No, it's not that their opinion matters less. We're talking about people's fundamental rights here to kind of both freedom of speech and also the right to listen. So I think people are more than entitled to campaign against views they disagree with. By all means, organise a protest, organise a petition. I might find it to be absurd, but, there are things that you can do that doesn't include, one, being threatening people, calling for someone to be removed or cancelled, to be demoted, and making it an incredibly hostile environment for people that want to listen to those views. I think that by all means disagree, by all means, protest, all of those things, but that should not impede on freedom of speech on campus.
Just finally, what did you think about this story, the Culture Secretary, Oliver Dowden, summoning 25 heritage bodies and telling them not to, in his words, rewrite history by illuminating the part the slave trade played in creating fortunes and the stately homes that we go and have a cup of tea and a wander around?
Yeah, I think history is not static, and our interpretations of it, aren't fixed and static. And so as the conversation evolves societally, often as we reinterpret history and look at it again and take into account new factors and social trends, that's great. But I think what we've seen in the last year is an attempt to actually construct a particular narrative about the past, particularly Western society, as one that is, fundamentally racist and that needs to, the removal of statues based off of this basis. I don't actually think that's a productive way to engage in history. I think that we should be engaging with a wide range of historians, similar to the question of freedom of speech, from all persuasions, and understanding history from a range of perspectives. And I think that it's a good thing, again, that the kind of government is responding to the way in which often public funds are instrumentalized to propagate certain political agendas. And I don't think that that's actually right. I think history should be shown and taught in its broad complexity, not from a particular political standpoint.
So the assertion that people who want to illuminate the sort of slave trade past to some of the National Trust buildings, the assertion that those people who are trying to illuminate history are rewriting history isn't true. But that doesn't seem right.
No, I don't think that necessarily that is always the case. I mean, Britain has been engaging with the questions of slavery and colonialism for decades. I also disagree with this idea that all of a sudden, in the summer last year, we just woke up to the fact that Britain, was a colonial power with slavery. That's been a process we've been engaging with. But I think that when a particular narrative about history, one that is deeply politicized in the form of questions of, institutional or systemic racism embedded in British society, is taught as the only or correct one, I don't think that's correct. And I think that cultural institutions whose very existence is to preserve and conserve history should make sure that they are showing the broad perspective of it, not just one particular perspective.